Here we are again. This time we're talking about the emerging self in preschool children. And to do this, we're going to split this up into different sections. But first, let's just nod to Erikson. His view says that this period between ages 3 to 6 is about the initiative versus guilt stage, where there's a conflict between a child wanting to act independently and the sometimes negative consequences of that action. Also important during this time is the development of a self-concept. That is your personal identity or set of beliefs about what you are like as an individual. So I want to start. One of the things that we know about preschoolers is that their initial sense of self is very concrete. So I thought I would use this time to just visit a few of the aspects of physical development that we kind of skipped, but I'll just touch on them here. So from 2 to 6, there's a lot of change. We look at this little chubby fellow and his little tiny arms and his short little legs. And then here's a 6-year-old who's kind of looking more and more like a regular person. The head is more in ratio to the rest of the body. And, this is important because one of the ways that children and preschoolers talk about who they are is they may say, I'm a big boy, or I have blue eyes, or but like one thing to realize that when we talk about physical development during this age, this is a bit of an aside in terms, it's not really related to self-concept. It's more of just understanding how children grow is the importance of nutrition and environmental factors. Low stress and good nutrition is important, and it will actually determine how tall you are. Granted, there's probably a genetic component that creates the sort of range of possibility in terms of how tall you could be. But one of the charts that I think really shows this very well is this Great Korean height divergence. Essentially, when North and South Korea were one country, all of the all of the population, the young adult males, that's how they um, measure this. They were the same height. And then, not long after the war, there began to be a divergence between the height of South Korean 18-year-old men and the height of North Korean 18-year-old men. And so, what you're seeing is the same genetic stock, essentially, having a very different outcome based on the different resources available in South Korea, which was increasingly rich and the children were plenty well fed, and North Korea, which was constantly experiencing famine and probably also the stress of a totalitarian regime. That's not to say that there wasn't stress in South Korea, but this shows you that the difference in height can be as much as a whole inch, more than an inch. In 1995, that's where this goes to. If you're interested in where the tallest people in the world are, this is an interesting link, which will give you a lot more. So, as we think about these early childhood environmental factors of good nutrition and low stress, then what we're realizing that can all have an impact on the height that the child will eventually grow to be. Another thing to think about in terms of the physical development, we read about this at the beginning of the first uh, the first chapter that we read for this week, is sleep. And I wanted to give you this set of advice about how to establish what this is an example of a good bedtime routine because sleep is so important and it's so difficult for preschoolers because one of the things, and maybe I can tie this to the self, is that preschoolers are in love with life, in love with learning and discovering, and they're bereft at the idea of having to go to sleep and leave it all behind, all of this wonder of the world that they're enjoying and the relationships that they love. So it can be just murder to get a preschooler to bed. But one of the things that they say is highly useful is establishing a regular bedtime routine. And it's recommended that the wind down, there's like a wind down period, and that might start a half an hour before the actual bedtime. And that's where you sort of give the warning, half an hour to bed, and you actually change your behavior. You're now moving slower and you're talking softer. You're giving these modeling cues of how what winding down looks like. You want your bedroom, if you can, to be cozy and quiet, and you want to try to keep that bed and all the cues associated with that bed all about sleeping and not about playing. You want to allow your child to choose the pajamas to wear and which stuffed animal to take to bed and what book to read. So there's some element of choice and autonomy that goes into this moment because they have to give up their choice and autonomy by shutting their eyes. So might as well give them a little bit of of autonomy on their way there. Then you could read the book or play soft, soothing music or sing a song. I always did. I never did the music, but I always sang a song, always read a book. Um, and often, as soon as he was probably 4, I think I even transitioned away from picture books and just went with the stories because it was sort of more soothing and more transitioning. It was straight into dreaming. And then you want to tuck your child into bed snugly for a feeling of security and maybe a kiss on the forehead. Whatever your ritual is, this sense of routine and ritual and repetition could be a big part in helping your child get enough sleep at night. It's also very nice and peaceful for you, too, if you can swing it. Another aspect of the child's physical development in preschool years is eating. And picky eating is like a thing. And so I'm going to have us watch this video just to amuse ourselves. And in some ways,
you want cookies?
Hold on.
But you have to eat your veggies first.
The in some ways you can see this picky eating business as a part of the emergence of the self. I mean, because in a big aspect of the self is what you want, what you don't want, and not being subjected to things that you don't want. So there's a whole bunch of assertion of autonomy, of decision-making power that's happening during this time as well, particularly when it comes to eating food. In part also because children's taste buds really are wacky, and they're very, and like when a food tastes bad, it tastes so bad, and their gag reflex is real. But we're going to watch this a little bit and just see a few examples of some real and some not so real um, episodes of picking eating.
Tyler, then I'm calling Aunt Jean. See, it's good, huh? Hey! You better not. I'm calling her. I'm fixing to dial her number right here.
Aww.
It's broccoli cheddar soup. It tastes like cheese. Now, I'm gonna count to 3. You're gonna take your bites, or you're going to your room. Ready? 1.
I'm going to move past these kids because I think they're fakers.
3.
I think they're really upset, but I think they're fakers.
Nope.
Here's another faker. He's pretty pleased with himself. Here's a preschooler.
If you don't get up in your chair and eat your dinner, I'm going to text
doesn't want to have to eat.
Oh, now this kid isn't faking. Oh,
Okay, get that fork going.
I don't know. I don't encourage this.
You're on video.
And now look, the dad's getting nicer when he told him he was on video. All right, let's move along.
What? We're going to.
This is funny.
I guess it's this one.
Green. What's the matter?
This is killing me.
Because you had to eat salad? How bad was it?
It's really bad.
You want to know it's really...
He didn't.
You said you hate this?
Obviously, the kid didn't say, I hate this. Okay, enough of that.
Why not? There's no poop on it.
Oh, God.
I would not serve you poop.
Oh, she's terrible. All right, enough of that. So picky eating is like a thing, and I don't have the answer to it, but I thought in case you, I do have some suggestions that could help with picky eating. I got this from a government website that encourages good nutrition. But one of the things to realize about picky eating is that it is normal and it's usually outgrown. Often foods that have weird criteria, like if it's seeds or if it's creamy or if it's red or if it's squishy, it'll be categorically refused. Because remember, these kids are forming their categories. They're forming their schema about the world. And so if they had something once and it was squishy, they may overgeneralize and assume that all squishy things are just as bad as that thing that they didn't like that first time they tried it. Sometimes picky eaters will only eat one thing. And also, picky eating is worse when there's a lot of distractions at meal times. And children are just sometimes, especially when it comes to food, afraid to try new things or afraid to try new things all at once. So but one thing to think about is that if you reduce your anxiety, it may reduce theirs. So getting into the battles or trying to call Santa and making a child miserable and assert your power over them is probably a bad idea. But here are some ideas that may be useful. So let the child choose food at the store that's healthy. And that could be really pretty in a produce aisle because things are so pretty. And that way, when you make the food, you could let the child become involved. And in doing, who knows, maybe they could just put the dressing on the salad before you toss it, or maybe they could toss it a little bit. You can offer a choice with a lesser evil. So instead of eat your broccoli or zucchini. They're probably going to choose zucchini. Make meal times happy times if that's possible. Also, there's a policy of try one bite and then don't fight. So the idea of introducing it multiple times, like I'm going to ask you to have one bite of this one food, and then I won't ask you again for a whole month. And that could seem like forever. Or I won't ask you again until fall. But when you give somebody another chance at a bite, they may eventually warm up to it. And the other thing is to introduce a new food one at a time. So in the context of a great meal that you know that they like, you could introduce a food like a vegetable but only one at a time, so it's not a sensory overload. Because in many ways, that's what you're dealing with here with the picky eating phenomenon, is some form of sensory overload. So that's my advice to you about picky eating. Let's go on and talk about more about the self as it develops. And here now we're going to talk about gender. And the fact that there are gender differences is clear. And I think I got this information from an example of gender differences. It was taken, like these charts were taken on were pasted on the wall of a kindergarten, and there were awards given next to each child's name. And this was 1994, which was, I guess, 30 years ago. It's not all that long ago. But the types of awards are what is interesting. The boys were given these awards: the very best thinker, the most eager learner, most imaginative, most enthusiastic, most scientific, best friend, Mr. Personality, hardest worker, best sense of humor. Here are the girls: all around sweetheart, sweetest personality, cutest personality, best sharer, best artist, biggest heart, best manners, best helper, most creative. So if this wasn't a highway to a lower paying job, I don't know what is. Anyway, this idea that there are gender differences and they're enforced in different places is an important idea that we need to make sense of. But there are gender differences that are based, so these would probably be cultural. These are like somebody has this idea that boys should get this type of award and girls should get this type of award because boys are the hard workers and girls are the helpers. Those are old, outdated gender stereotypes, but they still may be around lurking in the back of our heads. I do want to point out that there are biologically based gender differences. Obviously, there's like the body fat in different places, and there's the muscle mass, there's overall height. But it's very interesting to me to see how the brain and cognition is different. So men, on average, have bigger brains. It's true. Females, on average, have bigger corpus callosums. This is important because if you want to get into an argument about what makes you smarter, you could say size doesn't matter, but connectivity does. Maybe I'm showing my hand here in that I'm rooting for the girls, and that's not fair because there's obviously brilliant young men in my class that I also need to be rooting for equally as well, not to mention my son. Anyway, but males have bigger brains, women have bigger corpus callosums, and that's the part of the brain that connects one hemisphere to another. There are different reactions in the amygdala to aversive stimuli. Left amygdala or right for men, or left for women, right for men. The aversive stimuli, it occurs in a different place in the amygdala for men and women. And there are different patterns of thickness in brain cortex. So the brain cortex is where so much of the thinking happens, right? And different parts of the brain are thicker for men, while other parts are thicker for women. So there are differences, for sure. And in fact, this article argues that some people suggest that the brain could possibly be considered a sex organ. Anyway, so there are different perspectives on what causes gender differences. On one level, there's this idea that it's biological. Some suggest that girls are programmed, have evolved to be more nurturing, while boys are programmed and have evolved to be more aggressive. This may be a possibility, and plenty of people don't like this idea and think that everything can be explained by cultural factors. Another perspective on what causes gender differences is psychoanalytic. This would be Freud, where the idea is that there's an identification with the same-sex parent. The social learning perspective suggests that children are rewarded for gender stereotypical behavior and punished for violating these expectations. So the expectations of the culture is going to reward you or punish you, and you're going to do what you're rewarded for and avoid what you're not rewarded for. So then you adopt these gender stereotypical behaviors. And the cognitive perspective is that children, especially preschoolers, this brings us back to our preschool age group, are rigidly adhering to their newly developed categories and schemes. So, this rigidity of schemes, I mean, one of the things that Piaget said is that we're constantly revising our schemes, but sometimes schemes don't want to be revised that easily. So a boy is a boy and a girl and a girl, and that's pink and that's girls. And what I think that I'm seeing culturally as there's the feminism has more and more of an everyday influence are things like children rejecting the idea that there's a pink aisle at Target filled with Barbies and unicorns, and that there's a truck and army vehicle aisle for boys that's all navy, army green. And so more and more, the children that we're raising today are actually rejecting these divisions more so. That I'm saying is more of a pop cultural observation than it is evidence that I've read. I want to make sure that I'm telling you when I'm saying things that that there hasn't been research evidence for, and that's one of them. But I'd like to look at it more. The emotional self, like one of the things I just want to start with is when we're talking about the emotional self is the degree to which the emotions are the self. The emotions are the experience of the self. And that preschoolers have some very naive ideas about emotions that some people never outgrow. For example, if I feel bad, then I am bad. Or if I feel good, I am good. What a relief. If I make you feel bad, then I might be bad. I'm bad, especially if it's my mom. And if I make you feel good, then I'm good. Another naive idea is that my feelings are the truth. There's a lot of adults that believe this too. If I feel a certain way, then that's the truth. If I feel that masks are a infringement on my liberty, that makes me feel a certain way, then that's the truth. And you can't reason with them, you can't show them evidence, and it doesn't change anything. So I consider that perspective to be very naive and honestly immature. Another naive assumption about feelings that a preschooler might have is if I will always feel this way, especially if I'm sad, if I'm crying. I can't see an end. I don't have, as a preschooler, this sense of time that will sometimes just feeling that time will pass and my feelings will change is enough to soothe an upset person. One thing that my mother always said to me from the time I was a very little girl was, go to sleep. You'll feel better in the morning. So I might be weeping and destroyed and distraught the night before, and she would say, you'll feel better in the morning. And I always did. And in many ways, my upbringing was not a model of perfect emotion regulation and emotion coaching, but that one piece of softly spoken reassurance that time will pass and I won't always feel this way was very useful to me when I was growing up. And then another thing that they may think that's naive is, if you make me feel bad, then you are mean, right? So there's all sorts of immature ways of interpreting the world through emotions. And sometimes I don't think that the cognition that is provided to us by our emotional experience gets enough play in a developmental textbook. So therefore, emotional understanding and regulation and utilization, the utilization of emotions, needs to be taught to children. So this is sort of my treatise. This isn't from the book. I believe these things to be true. And I also believe these things to be needing to be adjusted and age appropriate. But children must be taught that their feelings are important information, but not the truth. At what age should this lesson be taught? I'm not sure. But emotions as information. Oh, you're feeling sad? That tells you that something isn't quite right here. Okay, children must be shown how to soothe. So, as when they're infants, when they're toddlers, we parents, we do the soothing. But then they also need to be encouraged and allowed to soothe themselves. Self-soothing is a major component of becoming a person and having a self that isn't in constant agony or in constant whiplash between a positive feeling and a negative feeling, but to actually become a master of one's own choice to calm down is a major thing to teach a child. Children must be taught that they can make choices that will affect how they feel. And children must be taught that their emotions are important to the process of achieving their goals. How they feel can either help them or hurt them meet their goals. And one of the things that's nice about this last one is that your emotions can either help you meet your goal or stand in the way of your goal, but in some ways your goal, your desire to get something done or to do something or to be somewhere, or your goal, what you want, is also in some ways an emotion of its own. But anyway, it's using an emotion to help regulate and organize emotions toward what it is you're looking for. Our book talked about self-conscious emotions, so the sense of self which emerges around 15 to 18 months is what makes possible these self-conscious emotions such as pride, shame, embarrassment, and guilt. And I thought it was very interesting that those who experience these self-conscious emotions actually show higher levels of empathy and helping behavior. I do not have an explanation for that, but I think it's fascinating. So also from age 2 to 4, what happens emotionally is that children are using more emotion words, and there's a greater understanding of the causes and consequences of these feelings that they're having. And from ages 4 to 5, there's greater ability to reflect on emotions, and there's an understanding that different people feel differently about the same circumstance. And that children know that there are social standards for emotional expressions. So I wanted to give you a little bit more insight on emotion coaching versus dismissing. We saw these parenting styles. This is actually provided by Gottman. They're emotion researchers that have done a lot of work with couples, and I don't need to go into them, but they're very interesting emotion researchers. And they came up with different parenting styles. Actually, if you go to this page, you'll see that there are 4 different parenting styles. But I'm only going to talk to you about the 2 that were highlighted in our textbook. And so an emotion coaching point of view or style is one that values a child's negative emotions as an opportunity for a caring exchange or intimacy, or an opportunity for us to know each other better, or an opportunity for you to learn something. The coach is also aware of and values his or her own emotions. They see negative emotions as an important arena for parenting. Like it's important to work with a child when they feel bad because it's an important part of learning. They don't poke fun or make light of a child's negative feelings like we saw in some of those picky eating videos. They don't say how the child should feel. And they use emotional moments as a time to listen to the child, emphasize with soothing words and affection, help the child name the emotion that he or she is feeling, and maybe help them, give them insight into why they're feeling that emotion, and offer guidance on regulating, setting limits to teach acceptable expressions of emotions in different contexts, and working through problem solving skills. So these are all really great things to do with your child in the face of their negative emotions. A less successful way of dealing with children's negative emotions is to dismiss them, to treat the child's feelings as unimportant or trivial, or ignore them, or just want those negative feelings to disappear quickly. Sometimes this can result in premature problem solving or soothing without understanding, so that sometimes, I think I'm talking about someone in my life, their eagerness to avoid the negative feeling on the part of the child can be an over involvement in solving their problems for them, and that's a bad idea too. The dismissing may see the child's emotions as a demand to fix things and resent them for it. The dismissing parent would minimize the child's feelings, downplaying the events that led to the emotion. Oh, you shouldn't feel that way. That wasn't that big of a deal. The dismissing parent does not problem solve with the child and believes that the passage of time will resolve most problems. So this might have been my mother when she said, "You'll feel better in the morning." And so this is why I became a motion researcher, because I grew up without understanding much of how I felt, and I was a bit of a mess. But um, uh, so this is why I probably spend so much time with you talking about emotions, because I feel like if you have some mastery over interacting with your child's emotions, you and your child will lead much happier lives. I think this is our last section, and this is the moral self. So a couple of key ideas in moral development. Um, Piaget saw moral development in terms of developing the ability to cooperate. Another concept that is important here is the idea of imminent justice, that if you break the rule, it leads to instant punishment. So I told my son when he was a preschooler that if he took his seatbelt off, because he was just old enough to manipulate his seatbelt, if he took it off, um, that I would get arrested. So it was very cruel and manipulative on my part, but he had this imminent justice belief that if he took it off, if he took off his seatbelt, the cops would pull me over and arrest me right then and there. So that's an example of that. There's also this concept of pro-social behavior, which is helping others, helping that benefits others, not necessarily yourself. Um, I'm not sure what I had in mind when I was talking about Bandura there, but I'm going to skip it and talk about empathy, because we didn't look at the Bobo doll experiment yet. I'm not sure if we will. But let's look at empathy. And empathy is the sense of feeling what someone else feels and being able to see how and why they would feel that way. And that continues to grow across childhood. But one of these moral things that I thought was really fascinating is this idea of social lying. Like, why do you lie? And in this video, let's see if I can, yeah, it's not too long. In this video, we see differences between boys and girls. So it kind of addresses gender differences. And also in this video, we see how and why they may lie. So let's watch it. All right. So I just love that girl. This girl, when the woman asked, "Should I give it to someone else?" And she's like, anyway, she makes a face of disgust but shakes her head in agreement. Anyway, so this is an example of social lying and how lying, which isn't a good thing necessarily, is seen here as a test for empathy. And so in this case, you could say that the girls were being more moral in the idea that they didn't want to hurt the feelings of the lemonade maker. So another thing that's important when we think about the self and understanding the self is differences in cultures. And so one core difference that a lot of cultural researchers identify is the difference between those with a collectivist orientation and an individualistic orientation. Now, we in the United States are kind of like super duper individualistic. Almost everything about our culture is we're out for ourselves. And if we don't take advantage of the situation, someone will take advantage of us. The collectivist orientation is one that says we're in it together, we belong in a group, we have a place and we belong in our place because that makes everything function better. And that collectivist orientation is more associated with Asian, Eastern cultures, so China and Japan and Korea, and even to some degree India. And there have been ways of looking at Hispanic cultures, or especially Hispanic immigrant cultures in the United States. And many researchers have found them to be more collectivistic, more family oriented than the United States culture at large. So in a collectivistic culture, there's going to be that where the group needs are put above the individual and that there's emphasis on harmony. There's a fear of rejection, and the hierarchy is valued as important to keeping the peace and harmony. But in the individualistic orientation, it's more about me, I consciousness. The individual needs are primary, and there's an emphasis on personal achievement. If you don't win, you're nothing. There's a fear of failure. Failure is more feared than rejection in this case, and self expression is valued. So these are two different orientations that we've already seen come up a little bit when we talked about preschools, and we saw that that China and Japan valued different things than those in the United States. And I think we will see this come up again and again. So as the self develops, the self is developing in a context that either is about putting the group needs above the individual or putting my needs above theirs, right? So let's just remember this difference, collectivistic versus individualistic.